Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Safety First, the economic cost of crime in South Africa. Your moderator today is Elise Leroux, Senior Researcher, African Futures and Innovation, ISS, with opening remarks by Fonte Akum, Executive Director, ISS, and Marie-Françoise Marie-Nelly, World Bank Country Director. For our online audience, please keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the event. Should you have any questions, kindly use the chat function on your Zoom application. The questions and comments will be sent to the moderator. To access the chat function, kindly scroll to the bottom of your Zoom application, click on the chat button, and a chat box will appear. Should you wish to raise your hand, kindly click on the reactions button to access the raise hand function. We will evaluate this event using an online poll for our online audience. The evaluation is completely anonymous and it helps us to present better events in future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It'll be launched following the presentations portion for today's event. Please note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on YouTube, Chatham House rule does not apply. You may be quoted without your express permission. As we wait for our final online participants to connect their audio, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion for today. This is Safety First, the economic cost of crime in South Africa. Fonte, you have the floor.
I can see an ambassador or two in the room. So, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, who are joining us from the ISS Zoom room here in Pretoria, as well as those who have kindly accepted to join us from the online audience as well, through the World Bank live events link, as well as the ISS YouTube channel. Good morning. Dumelang, Sani Bonani. That's as far as my learning of South Africa's languages goes at the moment, but I promise I'd learn a lot more. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the World Bank's South Africa Economic Update, number 14, titled Safety First, the Economic Cost of Crime. Anyone who has tuned into the radio while driving their kids to school, driving into work, driving to visit family, is reminded of the spectrum of crimes that occur in South Africa, as well as the complex web of alleged perpetrators. ISS would be politically correct to make them alleged until they are prosecuted and found guilty. From white-collar crimes, such as currency manipulation, to everyday home break-ins, and sexually and gender-based violence as well. Often, these hard news stories are accompanied by an editorialized sidebar that underlines the dearth of accountability and the struggle to actually get perpetrators to actually pay for these crimes. Beyond being newsworthy, crime has implications for lives, livelihoods, society, and the state in South Africa. Particular implications occur in the spaces of unemployment, poverty, and inequality as well. Today, the ISS is honored and delighted to partner with the World Bank Country Office in South Africa to spotlight the economic cost of crime. The ISS enters this conversation with a track record of over 3 decades of engagement on crime through collecting evidence, documenting, analyzing the data on crime statistics in order to inform effective social and economic policy, as well as operational responses. If you want to talk about effectiveness, we would say our effectiveness has not been very high, despite the fact that we trudge on, given the fact that we are seeing, or there's a perceived uptick in crime. By working with key stakeholders from government institutions and agencies, civil society and private sector partners, the ISS remains committed to building partnerships for a safer and more secure South Africa, for today and for South Africa's future generations as well. Therefore, this report is not only timely in its analysis, but is rich in policy and programmatic recommendations that would require quite a remarkable level of political will and leadership to begin reversing the implications of crime on South Africa's economy. I would like to particularly thank the moderator for accepting to moderate the conversation that would come through, as well as the panelists for joining a conversation which often gets very tense and dicey as well. But special thanks to the lead author of the report as well, Dr. Benedict Bodel. Without further ado, please allow me to kindly introduce our next speaker, Mrs. Marie-Françoise Marinelli, the World Bank Country Director for South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. Marie-Françoise is a certified public accountant with close to 20 years working in the World Bank, having led the bank's offices in the 2 Congos, which we know very well, the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Congo-Brazzaville. And she was also the country director in Nigeria from 2011 to 2015. As a proven leader, Marie-Françoise has been adept at spearheading targeted solutions-driven approaches to thorny developmental challenges, ranging from energy transitions to advancing the role of women and youth in science, tech, engineering, and mathematical disciplines. Without further ado, Marie-Thérèse, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Let me join Fonte to welcome all of you in the room, but I know that there are a number of participants online, so let me also recognize them. And I'd like to say that actually I've been in the World Bank for 30 years, not 20. I don't know if it makes it better or worse, actually. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here and would like to again thank Fonte, but also Dr. Cillier for hosting this very important, the launch of this important report with us today, with the focus, as mentioned by Fonte, on the economic impact of crimes. Let me also acknowledge the panelists and thank them for joining us to in fact reflect on this very important topic, as you have just illustrated, Fonte. But also I would like to recognize a number of stakeholders in country that have worked with us as we were shaping, first of all, when to decide that we would do this topic, which is not an easy topic. So it was already a first decision to choose this topic, and we consulted a number of stakeholders. And I'm happy to, as you mentioned, Fonte, to say that it's timely. And we saw that as we started to get, to think about it. And a number of stakeholders in the government, in the academia, but also others in the private sector, help us better understand what is the challenge of crime in South Africa, its underlying determinants, and more importantly, the impact that it has on the people's life, the livelihood, economic activity, and also the public sector. So what I would like to do is, before we talk about the report and the topic of crime, perhaps give you a few elements on what is the World Bank in South Africa, what we are doing, because not everybody perhaps knows our focus area. So first of all, I would like to say that really when the World Bank engages in the country is to support the country development priority programs. And this is what we are doing also in South Africa. And this is translated in a very strategic document that we call the Country Partnership Framework, the CPF, usually we call it in our jargon. And it captures the summary, the result of the engagement and the agreement that we have achieved with the government on key priorities of engagement. So at the moment, we are on the new CPF, who was discussed by our board in July 2021 and covers 5 years, fiscal year. Am I unmuted or I see unmute? Do they hear me? Because I see unmute. Yeah, okay, good, sorry. Yeah, so I was just saying that this document is a 5-year on the period of 2016, so 26, sorry, so 5 years. A little bit on what is it that we are doing. Essentially, the central tenet of the CPF is to help South Africa tackle the legacy of socioeconomic exclusion and achieve an inclusive society and a resilient also society. It is organized around 3 main areas of focus. The first one is really the promotion of greater competition and inclusion to create competitive market. The second is focused on jobs, particularly the job agenda more broadly, looking at both the demand and the supply side of the job challenges. And also we look at it through a value chain lens. And lastly, looking at more investment and efficiency improvement in the infrastructure sector. So all these 3 areas aim indeed at addressing the binding constraints to growth and inequality in South Africa. I should mention that we also have 3 cross-cutting themes of gender, governance, and digital. But we also look at our program through the regional lens, precisely because of the importance that South Africa is playing at the sub-regional level, but at the continental level. So it is designed in a very flexible manner so that we can adjust to address the energy and new needs of the country. And we have actually recently done a review, the 2nd year review of the CPF with the government and key stakeholders in government, which allowed us to further refine the priorities that we are looking at. And in that context, as you can imagine, energy, just transition is coming really as an area of increased focus for us. Now, let us move to the report, the subject of today's session. First of all, I'd like to say that we are always known for our financing. So the World Bank is a large financial institution for development, but actually a big part of our work is a knowledge work in the form of reports that we do at country level or sectoral levels as we prepare the CPFs, but also in knowledge exchange with other countries. For example, not long ago, I took a delegation of Botswana to Uruguay to see how Uruguay has managed to be among the top 10 exporters of meat. And why not have that in Southern Africa? And very recently, when we were in Marrakesh for the annual meetings, we took also 3 delegations of the country, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, to look at the largest solar plants in Morocco. And again, it's something that can be done in the Southern African region. And we saw how the participants were even visualizing where the plants could be in the Namibia desert or in the Botswana desert. So it's really a broad spectrum. But coming back to the report, I think that it's important to say that we do this regional economic update generally annually. And this update covers not only the update on the economic aspect, economic development of the country, but a specific focus. And we decide with our counterpart which topic to choose. And as I mentioned earlier this year, it is crime. But we have covered a number of, I think I would like to cite a few for you: trade and investment, competition and innovation, fiscal inclusion, inequality of opportunity, and of course, jobs, as you can imagine. And as a matter of fact, the 13th report, the last one, was really looking at building back after COVID, in post-COVID, but with a special focus on jobs. And I'm sure that you probably have seen it and read it. I will also want to mention that the really importance of this report is be able to connect the country. I mean, not only to provide an independent analysis in country. I mean, a lot has been done, for example, on crime in this country, but having an independent analysis is very useful, connected to the global development, and also benchmark the country in terms of the response, what is being done in other. And you probably have seen in the report that we make reference to a number of countries in this area. And more importantly, maybe the last key point that I want to make, because when we were preparing the report and we had the iteration, some readers felt that it didn't go deep enough in terms of recommendation. And we want to say that what we want to do with this report is really to indeed generate a debate in the country and maybe bring broad policy recommendation rather than being too prescriptive in the detail of what needs to be done. And as you will see in the presentation, the outcome of this first report already leads to further analysis and deeper discussion. So let me just say that in terms of the focus of the report on crime and why we have chosen crime, let me start maybe by the first chapter, which is the economic development in the country, which shows a weak economic outlook for South Africa. And it emphasizes how important it will be for South Africa to basically change gears and accelerate the pace of implementing much needed economic reforms to restart growth, create jobs, and tackle the challenge of inequality in the country. Essentially, how to help South Africa get out of the low growth, low employment trajectory that it finds itself now. And unfortunately, when we look at the outlook and the possible risk, we see that on the domestic front, the forthcoming elections risk to affect the pace of reforms required to indeed achieve this objective of getting out of this vicious cycle. And on the global environment, it's not much better because we see the geoeconomic fragmentation, the climate risk, and of course, the global economic growth uncertainties, given the fact that now the global growth is really at its lowest in the last decade. So with that context, the global context on the macro side, coming to the crimes, we see that this multifaceted challenging that are in front of the country are maybe exacerbated by the high rate of crime compared to other countries, and particularly similar comparators. You mentioned it again, Fontaine, and especially the other middle-income countries. And we know that crime, as you mentioned, affects every citizen, businesses, the small, the large one, the informal, the formal sector, and also all tiers of public sector. So really a very complex issue. It affects the whole South African economy and society, either directly or indirectly, through different channels. So the nature of crime also, as we have seen in the analysis, is changing because it's becoming more organized crime, cross-border crimes, and really more sophisticated crimes. So confronting the depth, breadth, and changing form of the crime problem and its socioeconomic costs is becoming increasingly critical for South Africa, again, for the future of the country. So this is what the second chapter offers, a detailed analysis with estimated costs of what crime costs to the economy, but it also shows the multidimensional impact of crime, how it affects, growth prospect of the country. So we hope that this report, as I said at the beginning, will not only stimulate a rich debate, but perhaps maybe a call for action, an urgent call for action, or maybe faster action, because it's not to say that nothing is happening. We've seen actually, as we were preparing the report, that a lot was happening. But the key is how to give new momentum, new impetus to this ongoing initiative. And I think more importantly, and it's going to be my last word, how we make it the agenda of the government, but the agenda of the society as a whole. So a whole government approach, a whole society approach. We hope that at least this discussion and the dissemination of this report will generate such approach. So with this word, I would like now to hand over to the team that has prepared the report, and I'd like to use the opportunity to thank them. The lead author is Benedict Badour, but let me also recognize some members of the larger team. Dumisani Nguena, who was part of the team. Where are you, Dumisani? Yeah, behind. Lolette, Kissinger Van Necker, and the leadership team, Marco Hernandez, who is the macro manager, as well as Jack Morisset, who is our lead economist and program leader. So with that, let me allow you, Benedict, to present the finding of the report. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this event. Just check on. Okay. Just some logistical details. So let me now share the presentation. All right, so thank you very much for joining us for this launch event this morning. So I will present the findings of the report. I will go briefly over some of the key messages in the first chapter, but really most of the presentation will focus on the findings in the focus chapter. So really the key message, on the recent development and outlook for South Africa is that the economy has returned to its trajectory of low growth. And this has characterized the economy over the last 15 years. And this trend has been driven by broad-based structural constraints, just to name a few, the scarcity of skills or limited competition in product markets, and of course, in the recent period, the intensification of the electricity crisis and growing transport bottleneck. And in the absence of bold structural reforms, we don't see significant changes, in the coming years. So we estimate growth at 0.7% this year and at 1.5% annually over the medium term. And this is well below forecast in other emerging economies. And so as a result, South Africa's GDP per capita has declined compared to the mid-2010, and it is projected to stagnate And so South Africa is falling behind its peers. And this trend of low economic growth has also been accompanied by weak job creation. So the job recovery has lagged, and the employment ratio in South Africa is among the lowest in the world. And this has hindered socioeconomic progress and notably a reduction, improvement in poverty, which remains very high. And again, we don't see significant changes under the current outlook. This weak growth environment has also constrained the fiscal revenue outlook, and adding to the challenges that fiscal policy is facing, including spending pressures. So interest payments have been the fastest rising expenditure categories for many years, and they are now confronted to the rise in global and domestic interest rates, and there are other pressures on other spending categories such as wages, social grants, or transfers to SOEs. And all of this makes it more difficult to adjust fiscal policy to preserve fiscal sustainability. And it also hinders structural shifts in the allocation of resources towards more growth-enhancing spending, such as public investment. So what can be done to change this trajectory? So if we look, decompose the underlying drivers of South Africa's growth and compare them to other successful emerging countries, we see that South Africa's position has eroded compared to its peers in all of its underlying drivers. So in public infrastructure and private investment, human capital, productivity, as well as the institutional capacity. And just to illustrate with a specific example, here you can see the growing gap in the trajectory of the stock of public capital in South Africa, the green line on the chart, compared to that of a country like Malaysia. So the government recognizes these challenges and has taken some measure to address some of them, notably important reforms in the electricity sector. However, we see that to achieve much higher and more inclusive growth, South Africa needs to broaden the scope of reforms and accelerate their implementation to address these weaknesses in the underlying drivers of growth. On the fiscal side, there is also a need to improve the allocation and the efficiency of public expenditure to improve and strengthen the impact of fiscal policy on growth. And all of this is especially important as the global outlook is the weakest in decades. So that now takes me to chapter 2. And MF has already talked a lot about why we've decided to focus on crime. So I'll just say very briefly that because it is a structural constraint on growth, and as we've seen in those first few slides, it is very important to think how to boost higher and more inclusive growth. And despite the fact that it is on everybody's minds, there are actually few studies that have tried to comprehensively estimate the cost of crime. And so we're trying to collect evidence of the magnitude of the crime challenge to contribute to the policy debate on the issue. So the scope of the work, the analysis focuses on economically motivated crimes. And so that is robberies, burglaries, carjackings. We also look at the impact of domestic organized crimes, and notably through the lens of infrastructure theft. However, we do not cost the impact of contact crimes, which are also very important and significant in South Africa, such as murders or gender-based violence. We also do not quantify the cost of international organized crime or corruption. And so we estimate the overall cost to the economy by summing up the cost that we are able to quantify for households, businesses, and the state. We benchmark South Africa against other countries and offer a policy discussion about how to combat crime. So we're able to estimate a total impact of crime at about close to 10% of GDP. This is definitely a lower bound estimate because, as we've seen, we're focusing on a subset of crime, and there are also many costs that are very difficult to quantify. However, it already highlights the magnitude of the challenge for the economy. So we can separate this cost into three buckets. First, we have what we call transfer costs, which we estimate around 3% of GDP. And these are the direct losses in assets and income that businesses and households suffer from as a result of crime. Then we have protection costs, which we quantify around 4% of GDP. And this is the security spending, again, from households and businesses and on insurance to protect and mitigate the impact of crime. And finally, we have opportunity costs, which here we're able to quantify at 3% of GDP. This is the category of crimes that is the most difficult to estimate and quantify, but also likely the most important. So that's why it is a lower bound estimate. But we're able to quantify some costs in terms of missed opportunities, economic opportunities for the private sector, and spending by the states above average in other countries that could be allocated to other spending. So it is important to note that not all of these costs are sunk costs or destruction of value within the economy. Transfer costs, for example, do benefit the new owners of the stolen goods and remain within the economy, or protection costs do benefit sectors that contribute to GDP. However, they can be understood as a tax on the households and firms that are affected by crime, and it distorts their consumption and investments decision, and so ultimately it contributes to the inefficient allocation of resources within the economy, and so negatively affects South Africa's growth potential. So now turning to, the report is organized around 5 key findings on the incidence of crime, and then the impact on businesses, households, infrastructure, and then a discussion of public spending efficiency. So the first point is that crime is very high in South Africa. Homicide rates are consistently within the top 5 in the world. And there is an established link in the literature between social fragmentation, which is very high in South Africa, and crime. But as we can see in the middle chart, even when controlling for the high level of inequality, the level of crime in South Africa looks very high. Another recent development has been the rise in organized crime, which takes many forms, here illustrated with kidnappings or carjacking. It has been on a rising trend, and especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. And the added challenge with organized crime is that because it is more sophisticated, it is more difficult to combat and more expensive to combat. So now turning to the cost on the economy. So we find that businesses are severely affected by economic crime. We quantify an overall impact of about 6.5% of GDP annually. And for those costs that we are able to put into perspective with other countries, which are the direct losses from crime and the cost of security, we can find that the cost for the South African formal sector is among the highest. And so that increases the cost of doing business. And it diverts resources for more productive uses, such as investment of innovation, which, as we've seen in earlier slide, has been an important factor behind the weak trend growth. And it is also likely to reduce foreign investment and tourism, which is an important sector for job creation. Another important fact to note is that access to protection is very unequal, and informal businesses are much less likely to be able to spend on protection, security, and insurance compared to formal sector firms. And that, again, contributes to the weak dynamism of the private sector ecosystem, and especially of the emergence of a dynamic private sector, for example, in underprivileged areas. Now, turning to households, well, about 1 in 5 households is affected by crime every year, and mainly through theft of personal property, housebreaking, and robberies. And again, security spending represents an important burden on households. Overall, households spend 4.7% of non-food expenditure on security, which is more than the spending on health and education combined. However, again, the access to security is highly unequal. And as you can see on the central chart, richer households are much more likely to be able to spend on security than poorer households. And because all households are vulnerable to crime, this unequal access to protection reinforces the already very high inequalities. Finally, crime affects households' behaviors and, for example, the decision to use public spaces, public transportation, and that, again, also contributes to weak economic dynamism, as it affects household consumption patterns, their ability to work and where to work or to start businesses, and as well their decision to emigrate for skilled workers at a time when South Africa already has a scarcity of skills. So one of the manifestations of the rise in organized crime has been growing infrastructure theft, which affects key networks in infrastructure, especially in the electricity, transport, and telecommunication sector. And here the main message is that the operators in these sectors do face significant direct costs and protection costs, as a result of damages to their infrastructure, and also because of rising and high security costs. But this only represents a fraction of the overall cost to the economy as a result of lost opportunities in terms of activities, exports, or fiscal revenue. And these are very difficult to fully quantify, but as an example, for copper theft alone, we estimate that the impact around 1% of GDP. So now turning to the public spending on public order and safety. So as I mentioned at the beginning, South Africa spends more than most countries on public safety and order, about 1 percentage point of GDP above the OECD average. And despite that, crime rates have been persistently high. And so we look at the drivers of that weak spending and efficiency, and we do see a significant decline in the police and justice institutions' capacity over the last 15 years, and notably to solve, investigate, and prosecute complex crimes. And this can be explained by several factors, including mismanagement and corruption in the context of state capture, as well as policies that have not been conducive to hiring and retaining the adequate skills. And so this decline in service delivery by the police and justice system has led to growing distrust in these institutions from the public, And as well as, it has created a sense of impunity among criminals and contributed to the rise in crime. So now looking ahead, what can be done? So it's important to highlight that the drivers of crimes are multidimensional, and so combating crime requires an integrated approach, around deterring crime and reducing the attractiveness of engaging in criminal activities, as well as increasing the expected return from legal activities. Looking at successful interventions of crime reduction, in different areas, we see that with well-designed and implemented policies, significant progress can be achieved. And just to cite a few examples here, for example, the city of Bogota in Colombia decreased rates of robbery and murder significantly through policing reform. And that was done without significant increases in the amount of police forces. Turning to violence prevention intervention, for example, the city of Chicago was able to reduce the likelihood of people to be arrested for crimes for participants in programs of counseling and after school sports targeted to youth most at risk to fall into violence. And there also are, good examples in South Africa. So Gauteng, reduced hijackings and robberies by significant amounts between 2009 and 2011 by implementing a targeted and coordinated strategy that was really rooted in a sound analysis and understanding of the underlying drivers of those crimes, and so targeted measures to specifically address that problem. So what does it mean for South Africa's actions against crime? Well, it's important to highlight that South Africa has institutional strengths, and tackling crime is also among government top priorities. But looking ahead, reversing the decline in the capacity of the police, as well as continuing progress, in addressing the legacy of state capture to rebuild South Africa's capacity to investigate, solve, and prosecute crimes, especially complex crimes, is a priority. However, sustainably reducing crime also requires addressing the root causes linked to post-socioeconomic outcomes. And so that necessitates, structural reforms to boost growth and job creation. But there is also evidence internationally that evidence-based violence prevention can also support crime reduction, and so these interventions can be scaled up. Finally, I want to end on the note that this is an attempt at providing an estimate of the cost of crime on South Africa, but as we have highlighted, there's more crimes and there are costs that are difficult to quantify. And so there is a need for continued analysis, and better data to fully comprehend the full economic impact and socioeconomic impact of crime, and design the adequate policies to address it. So this is the end of my presentation. I encourage you to download the report that I think will be available at noon on our website, and you can also find previous editions of the economic update. And I will now pass it on to Alice for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists if you could join me here on stage, please. I'm going to make it flat and comfortable and maybe. Next to you. So thank you, Benedict, for that presentation, which I think is quite sobering. I've got the pleasure now of introducing our panelists to you. And I'm only going to do it very shortly because I think we've got a lot to discuss today. Hermione, I'm going to start with you. So Hermione Premier, I think we all know that she's got a very strong background in public administration and law. She's currently working as a consultant at the Stolen Asset and Recovery Initiative, where she is supporting law enforcement in Moldova, Uzbekistan, Nigeria. She's also contracted as an anti-corruption specialist at the Globe Network, and she has many years of experience at the NPA, 10 of those as the regional head, as the asset forfeiture unit, and also a couple of years as the investigating director. And also next month, I've been informed that you will have a publication that will come out on management of stolen assets, and this will be launched at the Conference of the State Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Okay, then we've got Gareth. He has spent about 28 years working to promote public safety and justice in South Africa. He has been with the Institute for nearly 13 years, or maybe just a little bit over 13 years. He currently heads the Justice, Violence and Prevention Program, and he also supports the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which was established last year by President Trump. He has also recently authored a chapter on crime and the justice system in a 2022 book titled Better Choices, Ensuring South Africa's Future. Then Dr. Graham Wright. He is currently or presently serving as the CEO of Business Against Crime in South Africa. And he's also been with an organization in 2 sets of periods of time, but for more than 15 years. And he's played a very pivotal role in establishing government to business and business to business partnership. Graham also comes from a very strong scientific R&D background, where he served in various senior capacities within the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research for more than 15 years, as well as the Council for Mineral Technology and Tech. And then Mr. Ishmael Mominet, I've been told I can call you Momo. Hope that's appropriate. He is an advisor to the National Treasury. He has served at the National Treasury for 27 years, and 22 of those in leadership position in the organization as the Deputy Director General. Mr. Mominet has also focused, his focus at the National Treasury has been on formulating and designing the policy and legislative frameworks for the fiscal and financial governance and accountability system for the public sector, the intergovernmental fiscal framework, and the tax and financial regulatory system. So quite an esteemed panelist. And thank you for joining us. So without any further delay, I would now like to move over to Graham. I'm going to start with you. I think Benedict has shown us the cost to the economy and how high this is. And also, she showed us that businesses in particular are under a lot of constraint. I think one of the highlights that I saw is that 1 in 8 businesses are affected by crime yearly. So I think maybe from your perspective, as the CEO of Business Against Crime and the work that you're currently doing there, could you maybe elaborate on how crime affects business decisions in particular, and then also how important a detergent crime is for a business compared to other more physical constraints in the country?
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to also acknowledge the presence of Martin Kingston. He's the co-chair or the chair of Business for Business for South Africa, which is a prime driver of the government business partnership to address crime set up by the president. And I'm sure Martin would contribute to discussion as we go forward. Just in terms of the business issues around crime, I'm surprised it's only 1 in 8, because I suspect it's actually more. And we know that, in fact, all of us, in terms of civil society, are impacted by crime, either directly or indirectly. And the same goes for business. I have drawn up a few notes just in preparation for today. But I think the most important factor in addressing crime is the prevalence of violence that goes with the crime. That has an incredibly detrimental effect on business, as it does to civil society as well. And it does in fact affect investment decisions made by overseas parties to invest in the country, and so on. So it's a huge challenge for business itself. The overriding effect of violence affects not only the personnel within the business, but also the growth of the business as well, because of the sustainability and is affected as well. I think one of the major impacts as well is the impact on the business resources and the allocation of resources within the business community. In the years gone by, those resources used to be focused on developing the business, developing personnel, and becoming more competitive in a global sense. Whereas now, with the infusion of crime, those resources, or a lot of those resources, now have to go into combating crime and securing the business. So that's a major constraint that gets placed on business, because it does deflect the resources that are available. There is, of course, the converse position, where if a business does not invest in security, then that business is liable then for criminal attacks. It's open for criminal attacks because it's not secure enough to oppose those attacks. So the businesses are in a catch-21 situation where the businesses have to invest in securing the organization, plus securing supply chain routes and everything that goes with the business. So it's got no option but to do that and to be ahead of the game as much as possible in response to organized crime. And that infusion of funding into security is a cost to business, which then decreases the competitiveness of that particular business as well, in the global sense. Just to give you an example of what is happening at the moment, the movement of cash in the country is a very important part of the economic development of the country. And so cash and transit robberies, which almost happen on a day-to-day basis on average, they require a considerable investment by the banking sector, by the retail sector, to minimize that threat. So the investment that's required to move cash around the country and to minimize risks is incredibly taxing as well for the business community. And if you contrast that with another movement of product in the country, just a simple movement of bread, for example, in communities, in metropolitan areas, those movements of bread as a product is also coming under attack as well. So those companies that produce bread and supply into the retail sector have to respond in a sense of securing that supply chain of bread into the communities. So you can imagine now that manufacturing company where would not normally invest such investment in security is now obligated to do so. And that security requires actually almost a level of security that one would apply in the cash and transit industry to a degree. So you can imagine the cost implications for that particular company. So the implications of crime for business is enormous in terms of how does business then respond in an economic manner to do that. There's obviously the direct cost on impact of operations, and we see on a day-to-day basis almost supply chains get disrupted. The railway is not working efficiently, the road system not working efficiently, such that the supply chains of products and movements of products from ports into the stores and to consumers is disrupted. So that disruption is considerable, and it's very difficult to quantify from an economic point of view. But once again, it actually compromises the competitiveness of the country as well. And then these all impact foreign investment opportunities and the flow of funds into the country, which then affects the cost of capital and so on. So these matters are incredibly taxing for the business community. As a result of that, companies typically have to then factor in crime and security into their planning, strategic planning, and it becomes quite a considerable component of the strategic planning, whereas 20, 30 years ago, it was the ratio and the attention provided or devoted to crime was actually much less. And I think for many business people who've been involved in business over the years would appreciate that move. So strategic thought to competitiveness, how to compete with your competitors, regulatory matters, for example, have to be factored in. But then crime plays an overriding approach or role in these decision making as well. I think very briefly that's what I'd like to just to air at this point in time.
Thanks, Graham. We're going to return to you, but I want to stay on questions relating to the diagnostic report. So Momo, I want to ask you, the report very clearly talks about the cost of crime to public finances and the rise in organized crime and infrastructure there. You have headed the tax and the financial sector policy at the National Treasury. How much does crime affect public finance? I think is a question that we want to ask. And specifically through its impact on state-owned enterprises and the loss of tax revenue.
Okay, no, thanks for that. I'm going to go a bit beyond that in answering. I think, the paper by Benedicta, I think, is a brave attempt and a good attempt to the cost of crime. But like Graham said, it's not just 1 out of 8, but every business, every individual is going to factor in the impact of crime. Every woman, poor woman working in a town, staying in a township or an informal settlement will can only take a job perhaps till 4 o'clock because they need to get home by before it's dark, before load shedding. So it can get really dark. So I think the cost across society is immense. And I suspect the figure is much more than 10%. You just take all these effects into account because people have had to change the way they live, where they can work, how they can work, and so on. And I think the challenge that we face, and I think we've seen it, that the impact on our state-owned entities, as you mentioned, certainly on revenue, if you look at the impact. So you might say copper and steel crimes, might be 0.1% of GDP. But if you look at the broader impact on the loss of revenue, on the crippling of our rail networks, freight networks, how do you actually measure it? I think that's the difficulty even for the team. So clearly it's enormous. I think, though, I want to get onto, and I think the horrible lesson in South Africa is that crime actually pays. It's worth being a criminal because you're never going to get caught. And even if you get caught, it will take a few years before it comes up in court. And then the chances are that the case will fail, as we saw yesterday. Okay. So what's the lesson? Actually, just be bolder with these crimes because we're going to get away with it. And in a way, we've got to break that certainty that crime pays. And that really gets to the heart of the issue, which is we've got to rebuild state capability. But as we do that, we've got to improve our governance, processes, and fight corruption at the same time, because it really is like carrying water in a bucket with a hole. So when it gets to issues of resources, you can, even though we don't have fiscal space, you can provide more money to the criminal justice sector or to the health sector. So I don't want to just pick on the criminal justice sector, but I don't believe we'll improve anything, even if we double their budgets. Will Gauteng Health actually fix up the hospitals if we double their budget? When we say our infrastructure lags behind, for example, Malaysia, it would be interesting to see from the money that we actually intended to spend, what was actually spent or what didn't leak. And that's why the actual spending is low. So as we even provide more resources, you've got to ask the hard questions is, how will that really improve our capability, the state capability? So if you look at the criminal justice sector, and I noticed the paper, I'm not a crime expert, okay? It's not my area. But, we can all say you need more targeted policing, you need more intelligence-led policing, more evidence-based. If you give that money to the police, as an example, how will they actually do that? Last night I was talking to Sir Michael Barber, who's here, who's been focused on the effectiveness of government. When you look at the UK police, they've differentiated between obviously cops on the beat to those that deal with online crimes, which is an increasing element of financial crimes. And so if we were to provide more funding, is it just going to be spent on, in a sense, constables with a matric? Is it going to be spent on detectives? Is it going to be spent on forensic capability, etc.? And even if that's done, I don't believe that will automatically happen coming from the Treasury. And having been involved in the process to get South Africa out of grey listing and talking much more to our authorities, I also think there isn't a culture in our criminal justice system to get help from other countries. And does that help actually seep through? Does it change the way they investigate? So I'm not answering your question on the impact on state. I think that we can take as a given, just the impact. And clearly we need to fix up our state-owned entities. Clearly we need to get growth. We need to get jobs. All of that would help. But we still need to look at our mechanisms to deal with crime. So let me give you some examples. We can look at state capture. And for me, aside from what the Zondo Commission identified, I say, but what did the audit committees do? What did the auditors do? The auditors slept for 7 years. They kept on giving unqualified audits, even as they had evidence. Were our institutions independent enough to say things which would have upset the president at the time? Okay, because those failures of reporting as quickly as possible what was well known, what was happening, just in the media, has had a huge cost on society. So for me, it's about how do you fix up these institutions so that they act quicker and they do the obvious. But even as we do this, I also think, and as a non-lawyer, in our legal system, I don't know if you've got data, you've got the Gupta leaks, for example. Is that evidence admissible? Are our judges going to accept that kind of evidence in court? Or do they want original documents, whatever original documents are when it's out on the cloud? Okay. I really think we need to do that. And when we look at the grey listing, when we looked at some countries, they've had training programs for their judges, okay, training programs for their prosecutors, because people are not used to dealing with these crimes. So I think we can, and I want to end by just saying, we clearly need to do the obvious that we've already identified. We need to professionalize the police. We need to professionalize your prosecutors. We need to make sure they're independent. We need to check that they don't abuse their power when they exercise it. We need to make sure that they use the latest knowledge on how they investigate so that they don't mess up cases and that they act promptly. And if you look at even on grey listing, the issue of cross-border flows, of looking at virtual assets and so on, when I look at that, and in that sense, grey listing is frankly not bad for South Africa because it's identified that our laws were not up to scratch at the time, but our effectiveness was not up to scratch. So that we have a very naive system. And frankly, criminal syndicates are ruling and they're able to get around the system quite easily. And crime does pay. So the challenge is going to be, yes, if there are more resources, how do we actually use that to get the right expertise and the right culture in place? I don't have the answers, but that for me is the issue. The other issue, and I don't want to run away from governance reforms, because the processes for how we appoint, and we've seen it, how you appoint the NPA, Criminal Choice Job, National Director, whether it was a SARS commissioner. I mean, the Nugent Commission, Judge Nugent said we need to depoliticize these processes. Now, working actually not 27, 29 years with politicians, even with good politicians, you have to restrain that this is not your business to get involved in procurement. It's not your business to choose, it's not even cadre development, to choose, people who are PC, perhaps, for the head of the commissioner or the head of police. Depoliticizing those processes, I think, is critical. So not just getting a professional public service and an independent public service, but we got to say to ministers, thou shalt not do this. And if you do it, then you also will go to Chukis, okay? If you don't do that, I think you're never going to get that political admin interface right. And I don't think you're going to get the right culture in any of our institutions, including in the law enforcement agencies.
Thank you very much, Mama. I think a lot's been said there, but I can see both Gareth and Vivian really burning to respond to that. So I'm going to start with you, Vivian, and specifically around what Mama said around crime that pays. I think if we talk about specifically your experience at the NPA, do you think these institutions is equipped to investigate and to prosecute complex crime, specifically those linked to organized crime? And also, what do you think the role of these public institutions in combating crime should be, and what are their constraints? So we'll turn to the professionalization of police services when I get to Gareth, but specifically from your experience from the NPA, I think I would like to hear your response to what Momo just said. 4 minutes. I'll give you a little bit more.
I too welcome the research. I started my career in asset forfeiture, and one of the things we tried to do at the very beginning was make a case for spending money on building capacity to take the profit out of crime. And initially we thought, well, what we should do is say, this is the size of the criminal economy. If you spend, less than 1%, way less than 1% on dealing with that challenge, the returns will be incredible. And that's a much easier calculation than the one you did, right? Just trying to work out. I assume the first category of what are people losing through crime? It's the flip side of what is the profit that people are making from crime. I mean, and that was an international debate going on. And I attended a conference a few months ago, a UNODC conference on measuring the cost of corruption. And I think they come to a similar conclusion. It's astronomical. It's bigger than we can possibly imagine. And actually, it's not worth bothering with because we are doing so poorly that can we just focus on, like scaling it up so that it even registers that we are having an impact. So, after the first few speakers, I thought I'd just excuse myself and go and slit my wrist because it's deeply depressing stuff. And all I can add is, it's not like we're alone in this. Yes, we are doing, comparatively speaking, we're doing badly. And I think Momo touched on one of the reasons. I think we've been very isolationist about how we have the South African exceptionalism, the things that we experience, nobody else in the world experiences. So what can they tell us about how to solve our problems? That is an approach across the board. But the question I was asked to focus on is, declining institutional capacity, and do we have the capacity? And I can really only speak from the NPA. Do we have the capacity in the institutional capacity to deal with these challenges and the challenges that you didn't address, which is organized crime and serious corruption? And so to answer that question, I think the starting point is, what capacity does an institution need to be able to have an impact on what Momo describes as giving people more to fear from the authorities when they commit crime. At the moment, he's absolutely right. And I've seen this in my career. When I started in asset forfeiture, my first case involved a cash seizure of 87,000 rand. And I thought that was a lot of money. And my next case was 1 million rand in a suitcase from a well-known criminal at the airport. Fast forward 20 years later, when I returned to the NPA, and people are banding about figures I just can't get my head around. When the newspapers first reported on the bribe of the deputy minister, the alleged bribe offered by the Guptas to the deputy minister of finance of 600 million, right? I thought, that's just so outrageous. Like a bribe of 600 million, that I don't believe that. After my 3 years at the NPA, I figured that was a bit on the low side. And that, when you see, what was actually, paid in bribes offshore, that was a modest amount for what the hope was that he would be able to contribute. And the volumes that he was going to be able to divert, it was a modest investment. So the NPA has a couple of challenges, right? As an institution who needs capacity to give that kind of certainty. The crime picture you paint, right? Just on volume, the volume of crime being committed, the volumes being reported, and the volumes that then end up in the criminal justice system is not sustainable. There is just no way that you're going to be able to deal with all that crime. So what you need is capacity at leadership level to identify how you're going to prioritize. How are you going to work out where we should expend our effort? We do not have the luxury to do everything. But this is something we began recognizing when Bulelani Muka started, and I think Graham back in his day. We spent a lot of time and energy talking about how to prioritize. But you're dealing with a conservative institution like the NPA, where to this day, I think there's a belief that is unshakable, that in fact, I heard leadership of the NPA speak this belief in Parliament yesterday. They said, every case is important to somebody, and so it's very hard to prioritize one over the other. Absolutely, it's hard, but it is absolutely what needs to be done. Or we run the risk of addressing nobody's case, which is, I think, increasingly where we are headed, that we are so overwhelmed by what's coming in that we aren't able to apply proper attention to what needs to be prioritized. So global problem. I can't have stop without mentioning my two other bugbears. The NPA has a skills catastrophe. I put it various ways in my tenure there. It started with a problem, then it was a crisis, then it's a catastrophe. And it's a bigger catastrophe because there's no acknowledgement in the organization of the depth of the crisis. And so until you have that, at least in all these other spheres, everyone's recognizing the crisis. And there's a need to start addressing it.
And I want to get to that on how do we address it. I think that's quite important in our next round of discussions. So Gareth, the question around policy or police reform has come up, which is already more answering on how do we do that and how do we solve that. But before we get to that, so before you answer that, just hold off on that. I quickly want to just ask the question, and maybe just in a minute or two, is why is crime and violence so high in South Africa? How did we get into this mess? How did we end up here before we go to what is needed to be done about it?
The $1 million question we get asked all the time. There's not a simple answer, unfortunately, but we've used the World Health Organization sociological, ecological model of violence. So basically, over the last 2-3 decades, where there's been research internationally, where there's evidence, hard evidence of certain kinds of factors, risk factors that are the cause or very strongly associated with high levels of violence in particular communities, places. They've developed this model. So it has 4 components. It starts to a sort of macro level, your sort of history. Do you have a history of violence, conflict? Then you move into a kind of national political dynamic, what are the politics like? Then down to community level, what's going on in the community, and then finally an individual level. And each one of those sort of broad categories has hundreds of studies that show different specific factors. And we perform quite badly in all of them. It is only almost 30 years ago that we decided not that the state doesn't use violence as its primary way of controlling population. So for in our entire history, going back as far as you want, people used violence to control the population. Apartheid was the last configuration of this, and a very violent system where both the state thought it had a legitimate use of violence to control the population, and the response to that also legitimately seen as violence. That only ended at a political level 30 years ago. When that is happening, that means that violence is normatized within the population. So all white males went to the military during apartheid, and large numbers of black males were in self-defense units and various local community groups to fight against apartheid. So you're bringing violence into communities where violence is a legitimate way of dealing with the problem. And then we suddenly had democracy, but the trauma that caused, and the intergenerational violence that led to, hasn't gone away. And we didn't try to address that. We didn't fully appreciate how deep that, maybe it's a poor word, but culture was. And that continues to this day. And so when you have that level of violence in your communities, of course, you're going to have violence in the homes. So various studies have shown this year that about 80% to 90% of children in South Africa have experienced some form of direct violence, either in their homes or in the communities. They've either been a victim of it, so about 30 to 40% have experienced direct violence, but a large proportion of others have seen violence, either perpetrated against a loved one or a community member. And so this becomes normative. So in certain communities, in high violence areas, it becomes instrumental. If you're a young man and you're not willing to use violence, you're likely to be victimized. If you do use violence, you're likely to have some kind of social status, you're more likely to be able to navigate your way through that community. And of course, at intergroup level, whether it's a taxi association or whatever it might be, and particularly related to organized crime, violence is a tool as well. So if you are 2 gangs involved in illegal mining, the one that's got the most guns is going to control the shots. And it's simple as that. And that's not unique to South Africa. And I think one of the things is you often hear is, we're particularly violent. We have all the factors that lead to violence, and we have a high level of violence. But in many other countries and regions where we have similar factors, there's high levels of violence as well. And so I think we need to shift our mindset around this, because you also see that violence continues to this day in the state. The big operation at the moment in the police is Operation Shanele, which is thousands of overworked, demoralized, frustrated police officials with firearms, pulling over as many people they can to search them. And the rhetoric they're getting from our political leadership is be tough on crime and don't die with a gun in your hands and so-called shoot to kill mentality. So our vast resources of the state isn't being orientated towards reducing violence. It's repeating that problem. And until we have that mind shift, and you can see it in our politics, people love to dress up in military uniforms and call each other military names, and it's sort of in our culture. But that means that we're not getting out of it. If everybody thinks it's okay to be violent or to use symbols of violence, or it's okay to beat somebody up because they're a criminal, or you must have the death sentence, then we're never going to get out of this. And I think that's a big mind shift that we have to have. We're all political parties. Everybody is actually against all violence. There's no good victim to violence. We must reject violence in all its manifestations. And that then, of course, there's a whole lot of violence prevention interventions that start at early childhood development that have proven to work, and we'll get to that later.
But now I actually want to ask you that. So we'll start from that side and work our way back. If we talk about actions and policy actions, so specifically, what do you think should be South Africa's priorities in tackling this? And you are very welcome to touch on the police reform comment, because I know you're burning too.
Yeah, look, it's not going to be one department. And we've got a national integrated violence prevention strategy, which spells out a whole of society approach and what all government departments, all spheres must do. And I think that's one of the big problems, is that it's too complicated. And when you're talking about a whole of society approach, where do you start? You can't just start everywhere. So you've got to start with the public sector. So that you minimize your priority down from 62 million people to maybe 2 million people. All our teachers understand progressive discipline in schools and how to build trust in the education system? Do our public health workers understand that? Do all our government officials understand that? So maybe that would be the first start, is that there's interventions in the people who have the most contact with the population. So that would be talking to your sort of soft social, education, health, social development. There must be a huge investment there in violence prevention. In fact, many of it's really happening, but it's not fully understood in that way. And again, when you decide what should our Department of Social Development be spending its money on, it's in the report that about a tenth of what's spent on criminal justice is spent on violence prevention. But a lot of violence prevention is actually sort of post the violence fact. So shelters for women have already been abused, for example. A lot of budget goes into helping victims of violence, not actually preventing violence that we know can work. We've tested models in South Africa where we've seen reductions in corporal punishment in schools, all kind of things like that. Children less likely to be violent after going through this program. So it needs to be a much greater understand and make that a policy priority in those social departments. When it comes to the criminal justice system, again, it's about prioritizing and rethinking policing. Our policing system hasn't changed. Standing orders, the way we recruit, the way we train, 20 years ago is what's happening right now. With a lot more demoralization. And so we need to rethink that system. But we don't have luxury of time to transform a 180,000 personnel organization. So what I would say is that you need to look at the top leadership. The National Development Plan really has very clear recommendations. There needs to be a clear board, a multi-sectoral independent board to oversee that structure. Do we have the right people in the right positions? And are they working to a clear governance model to make sure they understand what are the priorities? How do we prioritize? And then how do we orientate our recruitment, our training, our performance management to achieve the objectives in this institution that we want? So what happens now is that we've got these very complicated performance management systems, never-ending budget that just keeps going up. It's over 90% higher than it was in 2012 when murders started increasing. The ability to solve murders dropped by 60% since then. So 90% bigger budget, 60% drop in the ability to solve murders. Last year, 12% murder dockets were detected. 88%, no one gets held accountable. Those 12% that are detected doesn't mean conviction. That means they can allocate the docket to a potential suspect. But the system means that for over 12 years, it gets worse and worse, and it's absolutely no response. It's not able to acknowledge as a problem, start shifting, trying to figure out how do we change things. It just carries on the same deterioration. And the only response we've seen in the last year or two has been, well, we're going to throw 30,000 more young men and women into this dysfunctional system. So we're not recruiting properly. 300 people in a forensic audit this year, and the college has found that those people had worked their way into police, they didn't actually apply. So they committed their first crime before they didn't become a police officer. And then the training is not up to scratch with are we training in communications? Are we training in project management? Are we training in problem solving? Are we recruiting for innovation? Are we recruiting low risk, more cautious people who think through situations before they act? No, we're recruiting the same way we did 20 years ago. So we've got to actually look at that. But I think right now, 30 police stations record pretty much 20% of all murders. So that's where we say we're going to separate the leadership from the current big mass organization that needs long-term reform. We put in systems for those 30 police stations, and we make sure we reduce murder in those 30 police stations using different evidence-based strategies and we can bring international people to help us with them, use local resources, so that we get murder down in those 30 and see what works. Because those 30 police stations are high density populated, underdeveloped areas, metro areas. And once we get a handle on what works in the South African context, because we have the people and the ability and resources, then we can start rolling that out. Because it'll tell us what training we need, what management systems or performance management and so forth. So that would be my
A lot of practical advice. So, and I think a conversation that can continue over lunch. Benedict also clearly mentioned that well-designed and implemented policies can be effective, and you show that it's effective in cities like Bogota and New York. So, Hermione, you've not just worked in South Africa, you've worked abroad as well. So I want just very, very briefly your input into what can institutions like the NPA do to strengthen their combat against corruption, crime, and organized crime.
I can only echo what has been said for the police. Applies equally to the NPA. Governance and a management model that is fit for purpose. I was going to stand on my skills soapbox earlier. I'm going to do it again because, the NPA has not defined what skills it requires to be able to deliver on this job. For the last, I don't know how many years, I've heard about a skills audit, right? And the results of the skills audit are never revealed. So I'm not even interested in the results. I'm interested in the criteria. What skills does the NPA appreciate they need? And, Gareth talking about policemen who are slower to act, or, increase the time between a stimulus and what they think an appropriate response is. I'm not even that high a level, right? I'm just saying the prosecution needs litigation skills. It needs people who have been on the inside of a court and have actually run a trial, right? So if you look at the Specialized Commercial Crimes Unit, how many prosecutors have spent more than a year running an actual trial? And hopefully with a positive outcome at the end of that trial, because there are some who have been in trials for the last 10 years never come to an end. So defining the skill set at all levels, right? At entry level, there's a huge debacle going on. I'm not answering the international question because I think that the basics need to be gotten right here before we try anything fancy. So just recruiting the right people. The Legal Practice Act stated objective is to create a professional legal practitioner, one path to entry into the profession for all legal practitioners. The first thing the prosecution did is carve out a lower standard for itself, a lower bar. So already we have prosecutors at a disadvantage. They don't have the kind of training that every other legal professional in this country is required to have. They don't have accredited training programs. So they are you're sending people to, fights really ill-equipped. And in that context, you'd expect, we have a limited range of issues we have to deal with, it's corruption, it's murder, let's set templates for these and make sure that people are covered with policies and procedures that help them think through what they need to do. I think the last time the prosecution policy was amended was 10 years ago. We haven't seen new prosecution policies, and times have changed. I mean, not just in the context of violence and how we deal with violence as a society, but the world has changed so dramatically. The way crime is committed now compared to the way crime was committed when I started as a prosecutor, digital evidence, if you haven't got policies and procedures for how you deal with computers and evidence on computers, you are dead in the water, because that's what everyone has, a cell phone, and everyone uses their cell phone. And if you don't have training materials, you don't have policies and procedures for how to deal with digital evidence, even before you get into the court, and then have training and capacity building around how that evidence is going to be presented, none of these outcomes we are seeing is surprising. So, you do have to get the basic institutional infrastructure in place. And as I said, all levels, because at the management level, you need the ability to take some very hard policy decisions, right? Unpopular, maybe even. And we need to be able to, you ask about policy choices and what policy choices should the NPA pursue. Well, it's for the NPA leadership to bring that to South African society, say, this is how we see our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is either gender-based violence, it's corruption, it's this, and this is the policy and the strategy that we're going to employ. Watch us, see how we do, help us, support us, but this is what we're going to employ. Rather than say, oh, broken windows, or, the Bogota example, or the 1MDB strategy for getting back proceeds of crime. These are all options available to South Africa. But things fall down in the implementation if you don't have the right leadership to drive these kinds of initiatives. And you get past this just folding back into the way we've always done this. We've always taken the docket and we don't send people away. We prosecute everything, which just means nobody gets prosecuted.
So I'm very cautious of time here, but I do want to end with our last two discussants here. But I do want to ask the online audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, if you could start typing that down, those would be noted and sent to me, and for the in-house audience as well, if you could start thinking so long around your questions. So Momo, just on public resource efficient expenditure, how do we get that right? You've said a lot in terms of what needs to be done. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that in the next minute or so, from a government perspective.
Look, I think there's a general issue in South Africa that generally, effectively, all our expenditure prioritizes paying my salary, public servants, no matter whether I perform or not, and obviously around grants. There's no real assessment of performance. And frankly, the performance systems we have, and yes, I'm guilty, in the treasury, I guess, behind it, but some of the performance measures that you have are nonsensical and they lead to perverse outcomes. How much money do you recover? Okay. So people then keep on finding monies, which actually Trevor Manuel used to say, even in the 1990s, that it was Willem Heath, that his abacus is different from that of the Treasury, because all these billions that are talked about never actually came through to the Treasury. So I don't know how you run policing, but just hearing what Amir is saying is, as an outsider, it seems to me that we don't prioritize cases, or even within cases, that we always have to charge 20 people, 15 people. Now, maybe if you're Fannie Williams and you're doing it with, all those people around Trump, and then you get people to tell on the main guy accused, fine, it would work, but it doesn't look like our system does that. And so I don't know how cases are done. I think you've talked about digital evidence. whether it's the police or the prosecuting, how do they analyze when they lose cases? How are people held accountable within those institutions? How do they know a prosecutor has done his or her work, or police has, done their work. Obviously, if they've got 200 cases, they're never going to do justice to their cases. Then maybe they need to have 5 cases maximum. Okay. Now, that's for me as an outsider. It's just talking out of my head. I might be talking complete nonsense, and I'm sure I am. So when you look at the public resources, I mean, the bigger question is, I think that if we knew it's going to lead to more prosecutions and bring down crime, I don't think, even with the fiscal squeeze, that I think we'll find the money. But at the moment, honestly, if you double the amount, is it really going to make any change? And so what's the point? Unless we get to the underlying issues, and we don't get to the underlying issues, really, we're just going to pay public servants more at the cost of society.
So we're all in the words of accountability coming up over and over, I think, throughout this discussion. Graham, I'm going to end with you. You've spoken about the impact of crime, not just on the private sector, but the amount that's needed to be invested in securing the operations of the private sector. So indeed a big impact. What is the private sector? How should the private sector support policy design? Do you think it should support policy design and the implementation to fight crime? What is the role of the private sector in this space? If you could end there.
Thank you. I think just building on the previous discussion about the impact of crime and business, as a result of that, businesses actually invested heavily in fighting crime and creating capacity to combat crime. And that's across all the different sectors. I don't think there's one sector that has not created an organization that looks at the sector issues and dealing with that in an integrated way with the sector. So that's an important factor. As a result of that, the industry and business has developed, I think, incredible capability, crime fighting and also analytical capabilities as well to fight crime, and especially supporting the investigations and prosecutions in taking cases through to court. So that partnership has existed over a number of years, especially in the financial sector. Banks in particular work very closely with the investigators, trying to capacitate them. So yes, I think business has got a very important role to play in transforming us from where we are at the moment to the state that we need to be in. And that really is built on the strength of business in terms of its capability, skills, which can be then transferred and enabled into the government sector as well. So I think that's a very important platform. The second important platform is this new initiative now that's been initiated by the President, where 3 priority areas have been defined. It's logistics, energy, and crime. So those are the 3 areas. And the call is for business to support government at an arm's length to improve the effectiveness and the delivery of those services into the community. So that is very important, and especially so that it's led by the President, and participants are cabinet leaders and DGs and so on. So that becomes a very important mechanism for influencing not only policy decisions, but also the implementation of those decisions as well. So that's where we are at the moment. It's an initiative which is fairly new, started in April this year, and it has now gathered momentum in those 3 areas. And there's a lot of positive and good work being done. But I think the role in business, especially in the crime fighting arena, very important, because business can bring skills into bear to help government to fill those gaps that exist, but also help them maybe to define the skills gaps that exist. And we need to work very hard at opening those channels in a trusted basis. And Business Against Crime has been working a lot shorter than ISS. We haven't hit 30 years yet. But I think that trust is in existence, as with ISS and government. I think we need to build on those trusts and to really help government and business and the organizations to really build a common consensus about what needs to be done. And I think we're moving into that direction in a very positive way. So for Business Against Crime, our priority is to build trust within the business community, the civil society, and organizations such as ISS, so that we can cooperate and deal with this massive challenge that we have, and then to use that in a positive way to work with government so that we can all jointly achieve what we need to achieve. So I think that's in brief the sort of vision that we have.
Thank you very much. It's much appreciated. I want to open to the audience here. I see we've got an extremely live online audience that's asking a lot of questions. So before I get to them, can I open the floor to maybe a set of 3 questions from the audience? Anybody, you can either ask a question to the panelists or then to Benedict, our presenter. But I see you've got your hand up as well. So maybe we can start with you. I'll give you. Okay, then a second question there and a third question there. We'll first do that round. So maybe if you could just, okay, not in your case, but just state your name when you ask your question, to whom it is directed. We'll take all 3 questions and then we'll have 1 round of answers.
Well, thank you. So I think a question, several of you have highlighted, the lack of skills in the key institutions. And we've also highlighted that skill scarcity is an issue in general in South Africa. And so I was just wondering, is it an issue that these institutions, because of their state at the moment, are not attractive for graduates to join them? Or is there a lack of skills, of those needed skills in South Africa? Thank you.
It's David by the name Statistics South Africa and the research. So the South African problem, even the Minister of Home Affairs confessed that it's a really serious problem with 1 million unaccounted legal immigrants. So which means somehow they also play part or participate the criminal activities that are taking place in the country in some way or how, if they are refugees or something. So I wanted to understand, the question is for social cohesion in general. For the long term, foreign currency issuer default rating, are we going to be convinced that the ratings are going to be the real results, or even after the other issues? Like for instance, bailout of we see from NPA, I think maybe the question could be directed to the criminals found another tricks. The trick and tricking now. For instance, business become implicated too. For instance, now if I get a gift, a Ferrari gift, now like for instance, the chairboard of National Commission, Lottery Commission, one exchanging of gifts and end up on the third party hands, which now, even if the preservation order was handed down by the court, it's still gonna be withdrawn. From that point of view also. So how now also NPA will extend the hand to safeguard and to protect, because even the proceeds even are not gonna go to local banks, they're going offshores. Also the digital crime.
Last question.
Okay, the stats confirm that 47% are using smartphones in the country. Globally versus the 88%, which impact the economy 0.14, GDP is 5.8 billion. But now the issue is like, is it still counted for within the GDP? Because we believe that money is still circulating and nothing is happening. So because we can also advise the police are still working on it with the wasteful expenditure, the central firearm register. I don't know the other departments.
Thank you. From Stats SA. Blessing, I'm going to ask you to frame your question.
Thank you so much. I'm Blessing Chipanda from ISS. Mine is not a question, but a contribution. I think the biggest challenge is why we are having high crime in South Africa. I think it's high inequality and poverty. So we can increase or improve legislation, policing, but if we don't address inequality and poverty, I think crime rate in South Africa will continue to rise.
Going to two elements that Benedict also attributed or contributed to. I'm going to ask from the MPA's perspective, if you want to answer, and Gareth, maybe just if you want to answer Benedict's question.
Well, I think we've done a lot of research. The issue of legal immigrants, there are some people in the country from other countries that are not documenting crime, but that is by no sense the reason why we have a high crime rate. All the evidence shows that the vast majority of all crimes committed by South Africans and foreign nationals who are committing crime are often working with South Africans. Organized networks. So it's a red herring. It's used to distract us and failures in government. I think it's just this ongoing thing, but there's just, I think about 2% of the people in our prisons are undocumented foreign nationals. Most people in the country who are here undocumented are here for economic opportunities and don't want to commit crime. I think the issue on the skills is, we excellent at keeping skilled people out of the country. So we have a skill shortage, and rather than just saying, if you have any skill, come to South Africa and we'll welcome you with open arms and you can share those skills, we try and create long, complicated lists that make sense to everybody and keep people. So, we are excellent at shooting ourselves in the foot.
Also, a topic that's been brought up in the media quite recently on how difficult it is for the skilled foreign nationals to enter South Africa.
Just answer the question on is it a skills shortage or in the country, or do we have the skills? It's just not in the organization. I believe we have the skills in the country. For prosecution, we certainly do, and where we don't, it's not something you import. You do have to create the machine that delivers those skills over time. So it does start with entry. I think Momo talked about recruiting the right people at the top level, but also at entry level. I brought with me Irene Mpofu here, who wrote to me when I was in my job, saying, I have just completed my LLB degree, and I would desperately love to make a contribution to fighting crime in this country. But there's no way to get into the prosecution because the aspirant prosecutor program has been, non-functional for years. And it's now been brought back on. And then yesterday there was an announcement again, it's off. The whole aspirant prosecutor program needs to be reevaluated. Are we getting the best and the brightest? We will, prosecutions around the world don't pay better than the private sector. That's just never going to happen. But the prosecution offers things that the private sector doesn't. I'd like to think you can sleep easy at night. It offers you exposure to litigation that you would not get in a private sector organization. As a prosecutor, on day one, you thrust into a court and you sink or swim, right? So it should be the training ground for the entire legal profession. And so entry levels need to be made more attractive, but people need to know that they're going to get excellent training. At the moment, the training is not excellent. In fact, it's poor, to put it politely. Whereas at the bars, at legal firms, everybody else is offering better legal training than the NPA is offering. It's an easy thing to fix. It's an easy, because the skills are already in the country, and it's just making sure it's raising the bar in the prosecution and not treating it as the stepchild of the legal profession, but really raising it up. What works in the US, why US prosecutors can take on the rich and powerful is there's, pejoratively it's called the revolving door, but positively, if people can come from the private sector into the prosecution and go out of the prosecution and back into it's easy to make those moves, and it's healthy to make those moves. Here, it can't happen for a whole host of reasons, but so at every level we are compounding the problem. As I said earlier, dealing with the skills crisis is having the rules in place, having the policies, the procedures, the know-how. These are things that should be in the prosecution and should attract people to the prosecution. That's not happening at the moment. And don't forget corruption.
You've also unknowingly answered Nell's question online where she asked what is being done to capacitate NPA members. So thank you for answering that as well. I'm going to allow 3 more questions from the in-house audience, and then I do want to turn to our online audience. Eric also has a burning question, and we'll give Eric the floor as well in a second. Okay, one question there.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kokeri. The comparison with a city like Bogota is quite an interesting one. It's a place West Africa you would think that wouldn't be. To what extent do we start looking at South Africa in the context of failed states and bureaucracies? And also, are we even dealing with the solutions when we are not considering the political question? To what extent is a crisis we're dealing with a function of a political leadership crisis? And also, the next layer of fixing the problem, you'd imagine it's in the government, in Pretoria itself, the total bureaucracy. The crime problem might just be, it epitomizes a bigger problem with a very bulky, failing bureaucracy. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Momo, if you want to respond to that. Very briefly.
Yeah. Look, there's no doubt that compared to 10 years ago, that state capability has been systematically destroyed. And unfortunately, with the state, I think you saw that in Zimbabwe, there's no floor to getting worse and worse. So, we're certainly not in a good space. But I think the elements are there to fix up. We've got the plans, but is the commitment there? So the way I see it, let's take corruption. I think many in government are committed to doing it, but are they committed enough to alienate their own comrades who may be implicated? Are they committed enough to do it to at the cost of losing friends, the alliance, and so on and so on? I think those are really the hard issues that maybe in South Africa we drunk on politics. We politicize everything. I think the US is also there, but we don't make these institutions work, and I don't think it's impossible. Our labor laws, holy grail, to the point where you can't get rid of the CEO of ESCOM. You can't get rid of maybe prosecutors who had the wrong culture. I think that at SARS, the commissioner was able to get rid of many in the top layer. And sometimes I think by failing to do that after state capture, we're now sitting with the problem of, are people sabotaging this change? So I don't think it's a question of failing. I think it's a question of the quality of leadership and having the ability to remove people or hire people. I mean, everything here, procurement, hiring people is a process and subject to legal challenges. So lawfare is a huge issue in our system.
Indeed. Eric, I know you are online. I am going to allow you to ask your question. I know this is directed at Graham. So you could go ahead, Eric.
Thanks very much. My name is Eric Kalsa. I'm the head of a program called ENACT, which works to enhance Africa's response to organized crime. I just wanted to tie up some of the input that we're getting from Momo and the World Bank speakers, with some from the floor. It seems to me we might be missing the point, right? Because apart from the GDP stat, which is very useful, none of this is really new. I mean, all the other information that was presented here, while useful, is not really groundbreaking. So my question becomes two. The first is to the World Bank representatives. Both of you said that crime has now remains a priority for government. My question is, other than statements from the ministers or the other interviewees and the platitudes that come out, is there any actual concrete evidence that that is real? And if so, what would that be? The second question I have is to Business Against Crime, the rep there, Graham Wright and so on. Business Against Crime has been operating for 27 years. During that time, crime has escalated dramatically. And that has been coincidental with the decline of the functions of the criminal justice system. Now we have Business for South Africa joining forces with Business Against Crime. And related to that first question that I asked, what's different now? What to your mind would be an indicator that this is much more likely to be successful than the obviously limited success that Business Against Crime has had? Thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah, so the World Bank wants to respond maybe to the first question, or should we start with the second question? The second, okay.
Okay, thanks, Eric. It's a fair question. But just remember, Business Against Crime is not directly responsible for the increase in crime rates. So, as you correctly stated, I mean, Business Against Crime has been there for 27 years, I think, supporting government and doing what it can do. So what's different? And it's a very good question. And it's a question that's on the mind of the B4SA initiative, to make sure that this initiative is going to be different to whatever's preceded it in the past. And so that question keeps on, is paramount in all streams, the energy, logistics, and crime streams as well. So in my mind, what's different is that this initiative is driven from the top in government. And we meet with the president every 6 weeks. We meet with the president and his leadership, with business leadership. So, and hard questions and engagement is undertaken in those discussions as well. So it's not just simply a case of meeting; it's a case of understanding where we are at the moment in terms of these crises, what needs to be done, and how are we going to do it? What's government's role? What's business's role? How can we, and then to make sure that whatever's agreed is implemented. And it's been said before, I think government is typically weak on implementation. So business's role is to help government to make sure that it's implemented properly with the proper resources provided. And those resources may come from government or from business or other sources as well. But so I can assure you it's not an easy route, right, that we go in, both for government and business, because there are ideological differences in some parties between government and business in terms of collaboration, and that's a fact. But the point is, it's an initiative which we believe is necessary given where we are in terms of crises in the country, both in those three streams, plus job creation and others as well. But we, as business, we're going to do whatever is necessary to make this successful, and to ensure that as a partnership, we are able to address these challenges. So the jury's still out, but that's our commitment.
Maybe I'd come on behalf of the World Bank first to say that maybe the first one said that this is not new, but we actually, and as Benedict pointed out, there is no comprehensive program that puts the issue together. So I think that this is, maybe there are, and we are not aware, but the idea is precisely coming and putting this element together and asking questions and, giving some orientation on what can be done. This is the first time I mentioned to you the types of topics that we have had in our economic update. This is the first time that we tackle crime, and it's a new area for us. But I think that it's good that we already come and we have this platform public-private civil society asking hard questions, and we hope that it is a beginning of a conversation. The second one is also how we highlight the importance and the impact of crime on economic activity. And I think that Graham put it very nicely in terms of the impact of enterprises. But also, I think that it was someone behind me who mentioned the link with inequality and how to address the root causes. So it's a very complex agenda that requires probably, a three or two or even three-tier approach. But the fact that we are coming and we are saying, look, this is costing, this is impacting, we need to start talking about it. It's, from our perspective, already a very important step. We know that there are initiatives. There is an integrated strategy partnership with the private sector. What Graham indicated to me is a really first. Sadly, sometimes South Africa is in the lead on showing how these elements are being approached. And I think that we will also look into it and see how we can help. There are some elements I mentioned at the beginning, the South-South exchange. I think that and the report shows how, for example, the city of Bogota has approached. These are some elements of partnership that can lead to concrete solutions. Of course, the South Africa is specific, as it is mentioned, the history of inequality, of exclusion, that partially explain that, but we have to start going beyond that and start coming with action. And I know that I said perhaps how do we come to a whole society approach, and I think that, Graham, you say that it will be a big endeavor, but just putting that on the table, I think that it starts creating movement. We are, for example, engaged with a platform of youth for the 5 countries that I'm supervising. And it's a type of issue that we will start bringing so that we can have engagement with various stakeholders. But we do feel that we would like to better understand, and we had actually, as we prepared the report, a series of conversation with the platform that Graham mentioned. We had Adrien and Tobin and even Martin as well. And I think that this is what we need to do, sir, that it is a problem in front of us. We could have said, well, we don't look at it because it's not the area of the World Bank, but we said, let us put on the table, let us try to see how it makes sense from an economic point of view. And then from there, it's really hopefully lead with zooming. Momo said, well, you are right below the target, it's much more. You said it's not one enterprise into 8. This is exactly the idea, is to say how we go deeper, how do we put it together? And I hope that we continue this conversation in a way that we can not only influence the policy debate, but also the implementation.
And indeed an invitation to, while we have lunch, to continue this discussion.
And I just say, what I would like to see is what is success going to look like. I think what accountability is the key thread, right? And we've all said that we have challenges with our performance management system. I've seen it over the 20 years, right? We don't agree on the metrics. And when the question somebody asks, if things go wrong, yesterday a case failed, right? What is the process for evaluating who's responsible? If you don't have accountability, nothing's going to change. And that's what we've had. We have new policies every year, new programs every year, but nobody at the end of it says that was a success or that was a failure. If it was a success, what worked? If it was a failure, what didn't work? So as you go in this process, I would like to, and I'm a very passionate observer of criminal justice issues in South Africa. You don't get more passionate and engaged. And I'm not seeing, so I share the question that the person asked, where are we targeting? What are we going to prioritize? And what does success look like? And at the end of the year, what would you say, that's what we did, and we did it well? Or if we don't do that well, we're going to explain to you why it didn't work so that we move forward. But the question was also about accountability. Is it a political problem? Can we expect our institutions to do better? We absolutely have to expect our institutions to do better than the politicians. Right? There's no two ways about it, and they can play an important role in moving us out of this morass, even if the politicians can't.
Let me just compliment if I know.
I am cautious of
Okay.
the online audience, so I do want to invite you to please, while we have lunch, to continue this conversation. So I'm not going to do it justice by summarizing this. So I want to ask Yaki Sylvia, who's the head of the African Futures and Innovation team, if he can just close and summarize this discussion. And while he moves to the stage, I can ask for online audience, if you don't mind giving this esteemed panel of experts a round of applause. Yaki, just one technicality. If I can ask the presenters and the speakers and the panelists after Yaki has announced lunch just to stay behind for a quick photo before leaving.
Thanks, Elise. So I've been in this room many, many times since the establishment of the Institute in 1991, where we have had many discussions on this issue. We have had numerous presentations, research that could probably fill this room. The problem is government does not believe in evidence. It believes in ideology. I wrote a book, Fate of the Nation, where I said ANC stands for absolutely no consequences, not for African National Congress. We have elections next year, and we have the opportunity to try and bring a degree of accountability to South Africa. And really, the country faces a number of challenges, and in crime and justice, we've led delegations overseas. We've written reports. The government keeps on appointing incompetent people at the most senior level and provides no leadership on these issues. It's been going on year after year, just gotten worse from one year to the next. So there's a degree of frustration with these issues, as you will evident from this. I want to thank the World Bank, Benedict, for an excellent report. Really fantastic. You've summarized, you captured issues that we wrestle with. After I stepped down as head of the Institute in 2015, I now lead a program that looks at long-term forecasting. And we look at where Africa and where South Africa is headed and try and forecast. And you've put numbers to the challenges and the issues and the drag that crime represents to the South African economy. And we've been bumbling along in South Africa for many years. I think your GDP per capita curve shows that very clearly. And without improving that, we cannot deal with the root causes of crime that Blessing referred to and that Gareth referred to when he was sketching out the model of what do we need to do. We need to fix the criminal justice system. We need to fix the economy. We need to get the country going. And without that, nothing else really is possible. I thought this was an excellent intervention. We've had engagement from government in a way. I know you no longer, but from business,
Still there.
civil society. Excellent. It represents the challenges and the issues that we continue to face. There are signs of success. And Graham, you and Gareth, in actual fact, pointed to some of the interventions and some of the efforts. And let's hope that we can turn the ship around. And I do believe we will. There have been real indications of success in certain areas. You mentioned SARS, for example. I think it was you that mentioned that. So we can change. But the clock is ticking. And while the clock is ticking, I want to thank everybody for their contribution. Elise for stepping in and chairing this. Thank you very much. For the World Bank for making this possible. And on a more positive note, I can invite you to lunch.